Welcome, everybody, to our session on shaping government responses and investments with effective policy and government relations. Apologies for the delay in starting our session this morning. A couple of tech issues, and we also wanted to give extra time to get in the room because the plenary ran a little bit late. I'm going to start our session off with a land acknowledgement. And the land that we are upon is the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. It was called Bytown, Unitown, Outawayas, and other names too. And I apologize if I did not pronounce that word properly. Ottawa is an Anishinaabe word, which means to trade. Ottawa is actually spelt exactly how it sounds, O-D-A-W-A. We recognize the Algonquins as the customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its tributaries. We honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory and uphold and uplift the voice and the values of the host nations. This morning, we are going to hear from three speakers. The first one we're going to hear from is called The Power of Public Policy as a Catalyst for Systematic Change. We welcome Chelsea Minhas from the Covenant House, Vancouver, for the first presentation. The second presentation is called Advocating for Change, a Budget Cycle Strategy with Taylor Briscoe from the Lightbulb Strategies. And our third presentation today is A Path Towards Ending the Housing Affordability Crisis, the Home Framework, from Indro, Bhattacharyya, and Stewart, Lazarus of the region of Peel. Just a quick housekeeping when we do Q&A at the end. If you would not mind to speak in the microphone about halfway down the room in the hallway. If you speak into that microphone, it will get recorded so that our folks online can hear the presentation and your questions and the answers. If you need the microphone brought to you, it looks like it's a cordless microphone. So maybe just give me a wave and I can definitely accommodate that. Thank you.
Hi everyone, how are we feeling? Good? My name is Chelsea and I am the Chief Program and Impact Officer at Covenant House, Vancouver, and I'm really grateful to be here today. How many of you are frontline staff in the room? Okay, great. So I am a social worker by trade, and I'm going to talk about public policy and the reason it's important to those of us who are working in this sector and to those of us who work and have a passion for the front line. So what is Covenant House? Covenant House is an organization that works with young people ages 16 to 24 who are homeless, at risk of homelessness, or experiencing trafficking. And we have a continuum of care that spans from street outreach to housing programming and has wraparound care and supports that service that continuum. And as we've been on our journey in Vancouver, we've been operating there for over 25 years, we began to realize that we were going to need to engage in public policy work if we wanted real systemic change and sustainable change. And there are a lot of folks in this room who do this work every day from an advocacy and policy standpoint who are much well-versed in this than me. But what I'm hoping I can do is give you a little bit of a crash course and help public policy not feel so scary to those of us who work in the nonprofit sector, and hopefully ignite some passion in you to join in this movement from this lens. So we're going to do a little bit of a crash course in public policy, and then my colleagues here are going to get into some of the details of the how. So what is public policy? When I'm talking about public policy, I'm generally talking about something that denotes both the general purpose of government action and the views on the best or preferred means of carrying it out. So more specifically, it refers to government actions designed to achieve one or more objectives. So for many of us in this room, that's ending homelessness. So said another way, it's in its simplest form, it's a choice made by government to undertake some course of action, or the choice not to. And the general character of public policy, therefore, is to guide action, a plan, a framework, a course of action, or inaction designed to deal with our social issues. It's important to note the difference between public policy and law, because they are different, and this matters when you're engaging in your work. And I know that some of you are feverishly taking notes, but all of my slides are in the app, so don't worry. And if you want any more information, just send me a note. So what is the difference between public policy and law? So public policy is the policy that outlines what a government is going to do and what it can achieve for the society as a whole. It also means what a government does not intend to do, and it often involves the principles that are needed for achieving that goal. Policies are only documents, but not necessarily law. However, these new policies can lead to law, versus law, which are a set of standards, principles, procedures that must be followed in society, and it's mainly made for implementing justice in the society. And there are various types of law: criminal laws, civil laws, international laws, all of which actually impact our work in the homelessness sector. You might be wondering, where does regulation fit into this? So regulation really fits in this tree. So I made this tree, well, somebody helped me make this tree because I'm not very good at PowerPoint. Again, social worker by trade. So regulation is a rule with a law that specifies how the ideas of the law are going to be implemented. And then we have the law, which is the policy written into legal language and passed by our elected officials. And then there's the policy or principle of action adopted, proposed by the government. And so as you can see here, we kind of think as the regulation as the branches of this tree. The law or the act is kind of the trunk of the tree, and then the policy are the seeds we plant. And at Covenant House, we decided we could have an impact in terms of policy through advocacy. So why is any of this important? Why am I a social worker working at Covenant House here to talk to you about social policy? It's really, really important because it impacts everyone's daily life. It's utilized in response to an issue or problem identified by the citizenry. So we heard this morning about how the citizens are so important, and we need to talk to our elected officials at all levels, and we need to use our voices, and we need to make sure that we're telling folks when they're not getting it right. So we as the citizenry, this is where we can have that impact. It addresses a wide range of issues, including both social and economic issues, and the overlap of those two, which we often see in many of the situations that we all address in our daily work. And those who are marginalized are likely marginalized as a result of both personal circumstances and poor public policy. Something we often talk about is that it's poor public policy that led to the failure in our housing systems, the gaps in our mental health systems, the opioid crisis that is facing many of our communities. And we're going to have to engage in public policy work if we want to see sustainable action and change in those areas. I'm the type of person who believes, and don't just take my word for it, so there is a theory behind this public policy. And so remembering some of the key elements of that public policy theory are important. So there are a few key elements that are important when we're talking about this. A clear course of action or inaction. It provides both guidance for government officials and accountability to all of us and the folks that we walk alongside. And it is public policy because it has to have these factors: impacts the citizenry, requires use of public resources, and involves a public policy governing body such as a council, a legislature, or a parliament. And remembering that all of this is about the public interest, all of us and the young, and in our case, the young people we walk alongside. There's some things that we like to note. Engaging in public policy, whether it's advocating for new public policy or revisions, is a great way to build your organization's social and political capital. And my new friends here will talk a little bit more about that today and the awesome work they're doing in that area in the Peel region. As advocates and thought leaders, engaging in public policy provides opportunities for your voice to be heard. As we heard this morning, everyone in these rooms is leaders, and what you're going to take back to your communities and implement and share with the people you work with is so important. And engaging in public policy work, this doesn't mean that you need to become an MLA or become an MP. It's just about how can we collectively use our voice. Over time, you may find yourself being invited to the table as you transition from influencers to pressure makers and sometimes de facto decision makers. How often are you called, by a relationship you might have in one of your level of government, or somebody who is an influential decision maker calling on you because of the relationships you've built to help them make better decisions? We want to be the people that the decision makers call when they have a choice to make, because we want that to be influenced by the people who are working on the front line, by the folks with lived experience. Are those voices making their way into our public policy? And what's our responsibility in that? Also, when you start to engage in this work, you'll be at the table to form those relationships with key stakeholders. There's a method to the madness. And oftentimes in our work, this can look like ally versus advocacy versus activism. There is no right or wrong. These are just different ways of engaging in public policy work. And it's important to know where you personally stand and when your organization stands. So an ally is known as one that is associated with another as a helper, a person or a group that provides assistance and support in an ongoing effort, activity, or struggle. An advocate is one who pleads the cause of another, defends or maintains cause or proposal, one who supports or promotes interests of groups. Many advocates in this room. An activist is somebody who advocates or practices activism, a person who uses or supports strong actions. One example could be public protest in support or in opposition of one side of a controversial issue. So I encourage you to just think about, where do you engage? At Covenant House, generally speaking, we are choosing to operate in the realm of advocacy at this time. It doesn't mean that at times we are an ally or that we need to engage in activism, but generally speaking, we approach public policy from an advocacy lens. And given that, oftentimes we can be considered a little bit less vocal. And I would challenge that belief around advocacy, and maybe the influence just looks different. Despite being less vocal publicly, we are and have been very much engaged in key public policy issues by sitting at various tables. These are some of the things that we do and have done at Covenant House Vancouver. When you're talking about advocacy, there's many different aspects of that, from public policy, political engagement, thought leadership, awareness, and collaboration. And it's important to be engaging in all of those areas. As you begin your journey into public policy, it's important to understand the cycle. And I'm just going to briefly touch on this because another one of my new friends is going to talk more about different cycles. But generally speaking, the way it works is there is problem identification, policy analysis, strategy and policy development, policy enactment, and policy implementation. All the while, there needs to be stakeholder engagement and education and evaluation. And that's where we, in advocacy, really want to turn up that heat. How many times do you see public policy happening, decisions being made, and that stakeholder engagement, education, and evaluation isn't happening? Are we making data-informed choices in terms of our public policy? Do we have good data as organizations that we can leverage? So now you want to get into it, you're all excited. Let's do this. Make a plan. Identify the problem that you're trying to focus on in terms of your policy advocacy. What are the unrealized needs, values, opportunities for improvement? What does solving that problem look like? What is your current state and what is your desired state? What data do you have to support those ideas? Then you want to do a policy analysis. What are the realities? Sometimes this is called an environmental scan. What are the societal, political, financial, etc.? Election seasons, how does that influence this? It's a great opportunity. And then your strategy and policy development. Who are the key actors? Who do you need to engage with? Who are the stakeholders? Are there opportunities to improve current policy, or do you need to create something new? And what kind of stakeholder activities will we undertake during each step of the policy cycle? And where is your commitment to including lived expertise, to including voices that are not generally at the table? How are you amplifying that? How are you bringing that voice to the table? How are you making sure that your policies have an inclusive worldview? Policy enactment. Who are the decision makers? What factors influence their decisions? Who are they as people, not just their political party, but what speaks to them? What do we need to provide them to ensure that they're fully informed? Do you have your homework ready? Do you have something that's easily digestible to present to them? And then there's policy implementation. How would this new policy roll out? What are the metrics for success? How will we measure those metrics? How are we going to have a continuous improvement evaluation process? What might be some of the unintended consequences of this rollout? Do you have risk mitigation strategies intact? Stakeholder engagement and education is so important. Sometimes your biggest role in advocacy and policy can be helping to inform about what's really happening. Not what's happening on the news, not what might be shared, at a dinner table, but what is truly happening in our communities. Engagement and education are key to good public policy. Even the most well thought out policies can fall short of their objective. We should be a continuous learning sector, and having conferences like this is part of that. So what do we think is the equation for success? Really good methodology, engagement, evaluation. That's going to lead to strong public policy. So what does it look like? Oftentimes, the citizenry dictates the priorities. Other times, the government dictates priorities. Election platforms, promises, mandate letters, and generally somewhere those two intersect. Make sure you do your homework before you begin crafting your policy. Do you have subject matter experts? Do you have folks with lived expertise? Have you done your research? What's come before you? There's oftentimes things we can learn, mistakes we don't need to double take. And create a stakeholder engagement strategy. Be intentional about this work. I know that when so many of us are in the thick of this work and we're very busy, and oftentimes this is done off the side of our desks, but we need to be encouraging our organizations, the folks that we work with, to not have this as a side of your desk priority, to really make this a strategic initiative of your organization, to dedicate the resources to it. I think we all talk about how we are in the business of sustainable change. We don't just want another flavor of the week. And if we want to achieve real change, we need to dedicate the resources, the time, the expertise, the investment in data to get this right. So just a few final thoughts before my new friends talk about more details of the how. How are we going to get this done together? Most social service providers have historically been focused on just delivery and only engage with public policy in reactionary fashion. So when something goes wrong, I think we see that a lot in our sector. A lot of what we do is very reactionary, and we're working so hard to move upstream and work from a more prevention lens. And the same is true of public policy. Let's get ahead of this. Let's help inform change. Let's do this work in a good way so that we're not just continuing to be reactionary to problems. To truly address societal inequities, the social service sector must become more proactive relative to matters of public policy. I think oftentimes, I know I've been guilty of this many times in my career, well, that's for the advocates. That's for the folks who work in government. No, that's for all of us to use our voice in a good way. Engaging in public policy allows you to not only exercise your influence, but to work alongside decision makers, which brings additional benefits that your organization can leverage. Your organization can become thought as that person who helps solve the solutions. When there's new opportunities for engagement or programming, these stakeholders will think about you because you've been at the table working alongside them to be a part of the solution, not just to bang on the doors when something goes wrong. You'll be seen as a valued thought partner. And it is going to take all of us, not just the social service sector, not just the government, the business sector. It's going to take all of us to create the communities that we all want to see and that the folks we serve deserve. Public policy is the only way to foster long-term systemic change. And just a final note that if us social workers at Covenant House and organizations who primarily operate in the service sector can do this work, we all can do it. And so if you ever want to lock arms to do this work together, that's what we're here for. And good luck, because you can do this and we're going to do it together. So thank you.
Which one is yours? There we go.
Well, good morning, everyone. So my name is Taylor Briscoe, and today I am representing Lightbulb Strategies. So we are a public affairs and government relations firm that works exclusively with NGOs and service providers, like many of you in the room, to advocate for all levels of government across Canada. So whether it's a municipal delegation pushing back against NIMBYism, up to federal funding changes, to provincial regulations, we've worked with all. And so that's where we're going to share our expertise of a strategy of when it comes to government relations. It can feel very overwhelming. I hear from a lot of our clients that it's a bit of an analysis paralysis problem. There's so much to do, and then we think about government and there's very specific ways that you have to interact with them, right down to their names, that we get a little overwhelmed and scared to step into the space. So I've had a decade-plus career now within government, both as I started my career as a federal staffer, so I have that kind of lens to provide, that I've sat in these rooms as the little note taker to know what's effective when you're a stakeholder in that room, to now representing a service provider. So my other hat, when I'm not working consulting with all of you, I'm proud to represent the Salvation Army as their Associate Director of Public Affairs across Canada. I see some colleagues in the room, so thank you. And then I've also made the leap recently into elected official office as well. So I am a city councillor in Stratford, Ontario, so just 6 hours or so down the road. And so I have now sat on both sides of government and know what's effective and what I need as an official, and also how to then deliver it as a stakeholder. So this is myself. So I am also upstairs, so if you want to continue the conversation, I'm in the exhibitor hall in booth 10. So today I want to go through Just defining a little bit about government affairs and public affairs and how that works, the tenets of relationship development so that we can get into that proactive relationship with government that Chelsea so beautifully outlined, the internal work needed to be successful. Government affairs is just as much an internal process in your organization as an outreach process to working with government. Assessing how and what we take to government, and then providing a little bit of a simple advocacy calendar based on government budget cycles to give you a little bit of a structure and strategy of how to work smart, not hard. Because you can work very, very hard at this and government will let you, but there's a way to do it in a kind of strategic way so that it doesn't feel that you're kind of shooting in the dark at all things. And then how do we measure that success? So to begin, government relations versus public affairs. So government relations, this is very audience focused. So it's organization to government. So this is both on the bureaucratic side as well as the ministerial or elected official side. So how we're engaging. And there is a relationship between both kind of entities within government, and how do they relate to one another, and how do we influence that relationship? How we kind of get in the door is really the foundation of your organizational reputation and the expertise. Oh, did it not change? Okay, this is what I thought you were looking at. So when we're talking about government relations, so it's that government audience. How we get in the door there is our organizational kind of reputation, depending on the level, and the expertise that you bring. And we'll talk more about really defining our expertise and kind of finding our lane and the value that we bring to government. And it really becomes, what's your expert identity to government? Me as a government official, what's the resource that you can offer me? What blind spot can you uncover for me? And that lens, the lens that you apply to your advocacy or narrative, that really kind of helps define your expert identity. So the ways that we get involved, as Chelsea outlined as well, developing legislation or regulation, speaking into it, depending on what part of the tree you're in, public policy, regulation, or law, talking about funding needs and explaining the human aspect of what that funding means, policy advocacy, lobby days, hosting receptions like we'll have later this week. Public affairs is more of the broad audience, so it still includes government, but it also includes all of us and the greater public. And so, again, we have a foundation and kind of reputational relationship with each other. Who are the big experts? Who are the go-tos within our sector? It really embodies the idea of, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, we go together. And this is something as a sector we're really seeing the necessity for and what government is asking for. We have so many voices. How do we come together? How do we unify messages? How do we then turn around and educate the public so they're joining kind of the cacophony of voices to say, this is where we want to go as a society? So that includes your public-facing campaigns, educational products and resources that, again, we share with each other, government and the public, creating kind of forum facilitation events, whether it's a roundtable, open houses, things like that. So how do we do government relationships really effectively? It really is just the basics of relationship development, especially for our frontline workers. The same way you build trust with a client is the same way you build trust with government. As an elected official, I promise there is not something that happens to us the second we get elected that we just become kind of opaque, unlistening individuals. We still are people, and we are there to listen. And so it is kind of defining that relationship of friend versus stranger. So if a stranger walked up to you and gave you a critique, how much kind of credence would you give that, especially if there was no solution provided afterwards? So you want to get to a level with your elected officials that you have a kind of friendly relationship, a respected relationship that's trusted, so that I can have those tough conversations. So I've been very fortunate using Salvation Army as an example. We've kind of done education, gained their trust, and then we've had to have some tough conversations to say, you're going about this the wrong way. It's been listened to, it's been respected, and we've had some really good conversations about what the solution and steps forward should be. You find common ground in service. We are all in this sector because we have a call to service. Government officials have felt that same pull. So we have that relationship. You always want to be in a solutions-based discussion and explaining what the mutual wins are. So it's not just you're doing A, B, and C wrong, and you exit the conversation. It's you're doing A, B, and C, here's the impact, and here's what you should be doing instead. You don't go into those conversations unless we have the solutions part as well. Otherwise, people will just shut down. The next one is really important and very often overlooked. Make sure you're at the correct level of government. What can this government official do for you? At the municipal level, I have very heated and angry phone calls consistently about problems that can only be dealt with at the provincial and federal level. It doesn't allow a lot of space to actually get into those solution-based discussions, and we're all people. We just shut down and we stop listening, and people want to stop engaging. So making sure you're at the correct level and the solutions and issues that you're talking about are tailored to that level of government. Maintain communications. Again, this isn't just a one-time show up, have a meeting. It's an ongoing relationship, just the way you would treat any friend. Maybe you don't see each other for a while, but then when you do, you catch up, and it's great. That's the same kind of relationship that we have with government. So we want to be maintaining constant communication. You have a great research project, flip it over to government. You have an event coming up, bring them in, get an invite out early. You want to be maintaining that relationship. The importance of follow up and follow through. As a staffer, I can't remember the amount of times we'd have a stakeholder in the room and they'd say, oh, I can get you more information on that. And they were never heard from again. So there is, if you have something to follow up with, have it ready to go before you get to that meeting. Role play with each other to say, what are his or her questions going to be when we're in that room? If they are going to ask, tell me more about this, make sure that you've already kind of had those kind of thought brainstorms and you have those follow-up materials ready to go to flip that official the second you leave that room, because they move on so quickly. You're one of 40 meetings potentially that day. You have to follow up and keep yourself at the front of their mind. And make sure you're how you treat others and the importance of staffers. Often overlooked are the staffers. The staffers are really who are going to drive your relationship with that elected official. Making sure from the moment you walk in and the EA seats you, treating them with kindness, include them in the conversation. What does it mean for them? Speak to their interests. They're the ones that actually are setting the agenda for that official. They're the ones that are kind of giving them, when you leave, they're the ones that have the conversation of, what did you think? They can be your champion just as much as that municipal official, so do not overlook the importance of staffers. And balance the power dynamic. And we'll get into this as well, especially in a service provision arena. Sometimes we worry about funding, and it makes it a very difficult relationship to navigate. How much can I push back without the potential risk of losing some really important funding? And how do I balance wanting to say yes to government with also our ideals and what we stand for? So we'll get into this now when we talk about the internal work of developing advocacy strategies. So first, you're going to need to define your government brand and your identity that you're going to present to government. Determine the issue areas that you absolutely are the go-to expert in. We understand that when we're talking about homelessness and poverty, it's a systemic issue, and there are so many building blocks that feed into that. What are the ones that you absolutely are the expert to come to on? And what are those other building blocks that maybe you take more an allied role in, that you support the other voices in our sector, that's their expertise? How do you support their advocacy? But figuring out what your lane is so that you aren't pulled into these other conversations. Determining your issue areas. What are the issues, again, that then support that brand identity? If this is your identity, what's important that we speak to those issues? Because sometimes if you don't speak, that could perhaps hurt your expertise. Or if you're over speaking into areas that go beyond, you're starting to lose scope of your identity. Define what your position is. So this, again, is done in a nonpartisan way. What does the organization stand for in these specific policy areas? But what are the spectrum of solutions? That this may be X. What are all the building blocks, policy-wise, regulatory-wise, that actually get us to that solution? Because that might be a 10, 15-plus year solution. What are the tangible pieces we can bring to government in between? And maybe this might be the absolute ultimate goal. But if we just got to here, that would be okay as well. What are those spectrum of solutions that you are going to champion? Because that's when we can have that solution-based discussion. And then identify the partnerships. Who else is working in this space? Making sure that you're aligned with messages. Who are some interesting partners that you could bring in? Then you want to determine your internal champions. Who's going to speak? Who's going to speak to government? Who is the best voice? Is it someone, do you have someone with lived experience? Do you have the capacity and resources to ensure that they're supported when they speak to government? That's a huge thing to consider. And who's going to do well in each venue? We have some that are incredible in speaking directly to power in a ministerial setting. but they absolutely do not want to work the room at a lobby day. Those are two different types of champions. We have some individuals that are incredible witnesses during testimony at committee hearings, but they don't want to do a one-on-one meeting. So figuring out who are your champions and how is that going to work. Determine your short-term and long-term goals and KPIs. Chelsea spoke about the importance of having measurables. And we'll get back to that. And then determine the tactics that you have the capacity and resources to do. Maybe you can't be hosting a large reception with government. Maybe you only have the capacity to go for 3 or 4 targeted meetings, because getting the relationship development to the point where you can get that meeting, that's a lot of time investment as well. So what are the tactics that you're going to pursue? I recommend looking at where do you want to go and then start working backwards. What are the relationships we need to develop? What is the internal infrastructure, those reports, those one-pagers, the messaging, training for individuals, and work backwards to figure out where do we start and how do we get there. So while you're doing all of this internally, the other part is now we have to figure out what government's doing. So we're figuring out our priorities. Now we need to analyze what are government's priorities. So how are we going to do that? Obviously looking at going right to foundational with their budget statements, their policy platforms, and what that looks like. Public, media, the sector, see what people are talking about. Looking at the cycle of government, how far into their mandate are there? Is it a budget cycle? What's coming up? Political climate, are we headed to an election? That's going to change what they're interested in. And where these two circles overlap in the middle, that's what our priorities going to government for that year are going to be. So why focus on the budget submission? It's a routine practice. So it happens every single year. It's a great entry point into starting government advocacy. It allows you to establish a routine internally of how you're going to talk about priorities and how we're going to engage with government. And it's a good kind of entryway into government advocacy. It creates that internal cycle and the internal infrastructure. There are lots of resources available. How to write a good budget submission. Government often has their own template. It removes a lot of that initial, what do we do? Lots of partnerships available. So it's a great, again, entry point to building up relationships within the sector. Who's going to endorse your budget submission? Who can you sign on to? Who can you share resources with? And it also allows for a lot of foundational discussions to happen with other teams. Public affairs is not a silo. You're going to be working with development. You're going to be working with your communications team, and it's incredibly important to do so. But it gives a lot of foundation to what events are we going to be hosting, what research are we going to publish, and so it has a good starting point. So this is based a little bit on the Ontario budget cycle, but it can be shifted for all provinces and federally as well. So in those first couple months, that's when we're going to start those internal tough discussions of what do we stand for, what do we need, what are the pain points. That's a good place to start, is what are our pain points and is there a government solution to addressing them? So we're starting that. If you notice within those discussions, and you're doing your government monitoring at the same time, that a big issue is coming up for you, but it's really not on government's radar, this is the time to also start those discussions of how do we set the agenda then? If it's not on the radar, how do we get it there? How are we going to leverage communications with op-eds, events? How do we get it into government water supply? This is also when you start socializing asks. Insider tip, this is when the budget in government is actually being drafted. So yes, it's going to come up that the submissions are coming available in November, October time. We're drafting now because we need a draft so that we get all that input from you. We go back to the draft, edit it, and then it's ready for release the following year. But this is when it's actually being drafted by all the staffers like myself behind the scenes, getting all the government asks, figuring out what needs to be done. So you start socializing it with your staffer connections. So you're asking, what is your minister looking for in the budget? What are you hearing is going into that budget? We would really like this. See what their feedback is. So you start socializing that with government and the sector. This is a huge opportunity for education, especially for government officials. If you have an ask coming up, giving them the foundational education in order to understand why you're asking for that, and especially putting the human face on the ask. Tours, forum facilitation. This is also when you're going to start looking at who are my target relationships that I'm going to need to develop to really drive home my budget asks. And budget, we say budget and we think financial. This is also an opportunity to put a lot of policy pieces into that. Then you're going to start looking at the language. So you have an ask, but what's the lens that we sell it to government with? We're talking a lot about, when we talk about housing, we've already seen how that narrative has shifted. It's gone from a housing kind of supply and demand economic lens. We're starting to venture into a public safety and security lens in many places, a healthcare lens in others. So how do we kind of change our lens? Drafting that submission, and now we're going to start connecting with others to say, what are you asking for? What are you advocating for? Our draft is now completed, and we're sharing it internally and with our sectoral partners for feedback and endorsement. We don't want to have 5 going one way and 1 going absolutely the other way. It gives a lot of confusion to government officials like myself of, I have all these experts and 1's going the other way. Now, there may be a nuance as to why 1 is going one way and 4 are going the other way. Then you have to be able to explain that nuance to government so that there doesn't have that confusion. And this is the most important part. You're going to develop your post-engagement strategy. It's not just pushing submit on these kind of submissions. There's a whole engagement strategy around that. Figuring out, okay, once we've pushed submit, how do we get the public on board through forum facilitation? How are we going to do public education? Yes, it goes to the minister, but who are the other individuals that this submission needs to get in front of and that I need to have a meeting to further explain why I'm asking for these things? This is when you go from those, all summer you've been working on those, building up relationships, getting to that kind of friend zone with all of your officials. This is when you switch from kind of that introductory meeting where you're establishing your brand and your expertise and your credibility with them to the ask, to say, okay, now you trust me, here's the ask. This is also a really great time to release any impactful research that dovetails well to your budget submission because it goes well to actually getting the public engagement going and you're starting to get that conversation. You submit, and now you execute the post-engagement strategy. So when I submit, I don't just go submit. I send it to all relevant ministers. I send it to every single member on a committee that is relevant to what I'm asking for. I send it to all local MPs or MLAs that may have a center or an issue area that is relevant to the budget submission, and I'm requesting meetings from all of them. So the goal for Salvation Army size, when we submit that budget, we're doing 30 to 40 meetings just on the budget submission alone to get champions to support what was in that budget statement. So then it just becomes meeting. This is also a time to ask to get on the calendar for the new year. We typically in government book calendars 3 to 4 months out. So if you want someone to show up for a Christmas event, send it in August, because by September, the staffer is setting the whole fall calendar, including Christmas. So that's kind of how you gotta go in advance. So now we're in the new year. There is a bit of that Christmas lull. So how do you get things back into the water supply? We typically ask ministers for kind of a resolution-based meeting to say, what are your goals for this next term? That gives some hints into like what the budget might be kind of leaning towards. We also want to review our own organizational goals, a lot of kind of fundraising and different financial things, maybe program evaluations have happened during that time. So what's changed in the Venn diagram? This is also when you're going to start seeing a lot of regulatory releases and engagement planning. So if you've looked for kind of something in the budget that lends itself to regulation, what are the kind of task forces or advisory committees that could spin out of that, and how do you start getting your name on that list now? So that's something to look into. We'll also start looking at kind of ongoing committee testimony on those big issue areas. A lot of committees will start looking at different regulations to implement for the budget. How do you lend your expertise in that setting? And we're just continuously doing government meetings. Finally, the budget comes out. We do a diagnosis of what are the wins, what are the missing items. Regardless of the potential missing items, send a congratulatory letter to all those involved for tabling it. Kindness goes a long way in government. We don't get a lot of it, so anytime you can take a moment to actually say congratulations or yes, that was a good idea, you have to do that just as much as all the others as well. Follow up for timelines and opportunities. That, okay, you've announced that this is coming in the budget. What's the timeline on that? Because that's going to lend itself to what I'm thinking about already for next year. Oh, you're not touching that for 2 years? Great. Won't worry about that. Let's worry about this then. So once they have these big ideas, figuring out what's the actual timeline of government implementation for those pieces, as well as asking for those opportunities. Are you going to have a task force out of this? Are you going to have committee testimony on this? What are the other opportunities I can continue speaking to you on this item? This is when you get all your plan and summer tours and invites out. So based on what was missing, you're already thinking ahead to what's that next budget going to need to include. Because these are the things that they missed out on. So now I know what I need to plan education-wise and what I need to tour. You're also going to see probably 1 to 3 major legislative pieces coinciding with the budget. These are really good thematic agenda clues of where government is going. So again, now we're already into next year. We're already thinking about what's the next kind of budget and policy pieces that we need to be discussing and getting them educated on. Now that the budget's out, you're also looking at how do I coordinate with my other 2 levels of government? If the province is doing X, what does that mean for municipal? What does that mean for federal? How do I change my lens to that correct level of government to say, okay, the province is doing this, municipality, this is what your funding is going to look like, this is how I can help. Or municipality, they're downloading this to you, here's where I can help. Then you start those conversations with your other levels of government. And then you're starting to, again, now we're back into that Venn diagram, but those missing items now become our foundation again. So what was missing? Let's relook at that spectrum of solutions. Let's look at then what research projects we could use to address those gaps. What are the public campaigns? What are the sectoral campaigns? And then we start it all over again. And we continue to work through that process. And that's the way the budget can really help kind of lend a foundational strategy to your advocacy processes. So then again, we're right back to educational needs, setting the agenda, developing those relationships. So how do we do this? So first, there's foundational infrastructure. It requires a great deal of monitoring capacity and analytic capacity, and we're all doing this off the corner of our desk. I do promise that once we get into the routine of it, it becomes almost like second nature. You hear a passing kind of TV comment, and you go, oh, that's what's happening. You can also bring in extra help. There's consultants like myself and all over. Work together to share the workload as a sector to figure out what we need. Getting those foundational kind of materials on your organization, your programs, your needs set. Getting just basic templates, thank you letters, congratulatory letters, event letters takes a huge burden off as well. So developing your internal foundational infrastructure and monitoring practices. Knowing your organizational identity will keep you on the straight and narrow so that you're working, again, working smart, not hard. So you're not kind of letting passion dictate some things and running in a bunch of different directions and kind of missing that true piece. And then the other part is measuring success. So we'll define KPIs, but the piece I want to leave you with is that we are uniquely positioned not just in our expertise, but in who we are and kind of what calls us to this work. To be successful in advocacy. Just like social service delivery, you can burn out really quickly because you just want to do so much for everyone. Public affairs is a long game. And so one of my team members, she's been running shelters for 35 years, huge mentor of mine. She said, she shared this story with me, and I'll leave this with you. She had seen a man come in 15 years before he made a change to really then move into sobriety and a stable living environment, and then begin working as a peer support worker. And she said he shared with her that, yeah, I was on that 15-year journey in and out of your life, but it was something 8 years ago you said to me that really saved my life, and it just took a long time for it to take root. Advocacy is the exact same. You don't know who you're speaking to in that room. That little note taker could be the MPP the next 15 years. That's how this works. So you have to approach it with the same piece. Just because you asked for it 1 time, 2 times, 10 times, it could still take another 10 times before we get there, but we have to keep asking. I now, as a public official, am implementing ideas I heard as an intern 15 years ago. So that's the power of this. It's why we have to keep doing it. And so I hope that you will engage. And if you need any help, please come speak to me. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for attending this session, and thank you, Chelsea and Taylor, for your presentations. Really set the groundwork for what we're talking about this morning. My name's Stewart, Lazarus. I'm representing Peel Region as a communications advisor.
And I'm Indro, Bhattacharyya. I'm an advisor for public policy and government relations.
And we're excited to talk to you about how we're kind of at an inflection point at Peel in shaping advocacy, policy positions, and improving our communications. I'll start with a spoiler alert. This is not a case study of how we succeeded. We are in this work right now. We are learning along the way. We've had some successes, we've had some setbacks, but really excited to share where we are with you and then gain some either feedback or discussions throughout this conference. Won't spend too much time on this slide, but really want to give an overview of what the affordable housing crisis looks like in Peel. It won't be a surprise. It is not great. It is not good. What I want you to pay attention to in this slide is how we tell this story and how we communicate. We're deliberately trying to get away from the wonky wording, the complicated language, the complexities in terms of storytelling, and make sure we're really describing as well as possible what it feels like to be in this state of crisis, how long it could take to get support, and what level of need we're actually meeting. Especially if you look at the bottom right, we are not able to support 4 out of 5 households that come to us seeking support. That is terrible. That is dire. And how do we keep our staff engaged? How do we keep our staff motivated? How do we deliver on our promise to our clients that we will help them the best we can without burning any bridges, without undermining our credibility, but at the same time being honest? What do we do here? It's a really interesting dilemma, and it's one that we're just starting to grapple with in the last couple of years. In terms of what Peel Region does, Housing Services, that's the department that is the service manager for the affordable housing sector. To put it simply, we help residents get and keep housing and prevent homelessness. So from providing emergency shelter and subsidized housing, to different programs that prevent evictions and make sure people are stably housed to prevent further homelessness or other precarious housing situations. We're also actively trying to prevent homelessness in the community. You'll see in the small print, this is also new, we're trying to be way more forthcoming with the fact that we do this work in an extremely underfunded, overburdened, and strained system. This creates a complicated dichotomy, right? Because we want to motivate, we want to empower, and we want clients who reach out with housing support, with housing needs, knowing just what courage it takes to make that first phone call or that first conversation. How do we deliver on our promise to do whatever we can to help them while making it very clear that we're doing the best we can in a system that is not always friendly to us, in terms of funding, I should say. What we do and what I do in close partnership with Indro is try to figure out how we can use our communications to get our story out there and put our need front and center in the stakeholders, whether it's government, nonprofits, service providers, and other advocates. We do see a lot of risks and opportunities with our storytelling. So for one instance, when we think about the housing crisis or just affordable housing in general, it could be quite broad, it could be scary, and I like what Taylor, what you were saying with the analysis paralysis. It's very easy to opt out and say, I'm not gonna be able to make a dent in this, it's way too out there, let me just slowly exit the room and close the door on my way out. How do we change that? Interestingly enough, in Peel, I know different municipalities go by social services or human services. We're part of a human services division. So it sounds obvious to us, but it took a lot of work to think about maybe we need human stories in human services, maybe put the humans front and center to get our messaging across. So we're always trying to lead with that, whether it's through clients, through staffs, through partnership. Who are the people that are doing this work and most impacted by it? At the same time, we understand the media cycle and how things move very quickly. We want to get the answer in real time, move on. What can I do to help? And if it's not easy enough, I don't need to get involved. How do we take a moment to go slow to go fast? How do we set that groundwork to make sure we're giving room for in-depth conversations? We're allowing nuance to happen. We're allowing people to ask questions that may not have an easy answer when your social feed, your emails are piling up and you need something quick and easy. At the same time, we also know that there's a lot of opposition in this work. And we'll talk about the different audiences in a moment, but there is a risk here. Are we going to trigger any negative outcomes or negative attitudes that are becoming more vocal? How do we do that dance of being very clear where we are, what challenges we face, without inviting unnecessary scrutiny about how we got there and getting more people in an opposition state? And of course, we want to destigmatize what we're seeing in the community. We do have a lot of NIMBYism, as I mentioned, there's a reason why people are in this state. It's at the individual level, it's not the system level. How can we highlight the success stories, but also not those success stories, right? How do we make sure we're being real in our storytelling and not trying to bias anyone to think or act in one way or another? For a while, when we were thinking about our communications, tactics, and strategies, we tended to get stuck in this general public attitude. Who are we communicating for? Anyone who needs it, anyone who wants it. Which, understanding where we come from in a service provision field, communications is not front of mind, and to be frank, nor should it be. We're focused on service delivery. But what we tried to do, and this took months of work with our leadership team, is to break down the different types of people and different audiences we could communicate with. So in the green, we have people who have received our services, people who are clients of ours. They've been impacted by our work directly. How do we communicate to them? How do we engage them in our work? And how do we work with them, whatever they're comfortable with, to get their stories across? This is an interesting group because this is where we have the most compelling stories, the most emotional and heart-stopping and heart-grabbing work and experiences. At the same time, we know a lot of people who have received our support don't necessarily want to be identified as the service recipient or the client for the rest of their lives or even shortly after. At the same time, we want to be very intentional that nobody who receives support is owed, or they don't owe us their story, their testimony, their witness. So how do we empower without putting pressure? At the same time, we also have people who are very engaged and are advocates and are allies, Chelsea, like you were talking about, who may not have received support or have needed support, but are really advocating for those people. How do we engage them in our work? How do we work with them to get their stories across without necessarily speaking for people or trying to spotlight others' experiences? Where we've spent, frankly, too much time in the past is that ambivalent audience. We've had a lot of discussions with our leadership team around, well, people don't know what we do. We're not doing a good enough job of getting our message across. Why don't people know about housing services? And the reality is, if people don't need the support or they don't have a personal connection to someone who does, they really might not see a connection. For a long time, that was seen as scary and frightening, but we've had to do a very careful and drawn out and delicate process to let the staff know and the leadership team, that's okay. Let people who are ambivalent right now stay there because there's a very unlikely chance that we can engage them in a high impact way or in a hostile way. But that took a lot of work as well. And then of course we have the NIMBYs, the people who are very angry, the people who are very hostile to our work. How do we listen to their concerns? A lot of the times they are valid or at least rooted in some validness without making it too loud, too negative, and drowning out the good work that is being done. So these are just kind of the different audiences we've developed as a storytelling and communication strategy. When we talk about advocacy, a lot of what we've been doing in the past is just trying to get more support for our services from government and other funders. We would start with, this is the need we're seeing in Peel. This is what we need to do to solve it. Help us. Of course, that's very valid. That's what you need to do. But what Chelsea, you touched on is that upstream solution. How can we go a little bit deeper and talk about the causes of the issues we're facing and what could be done to prevent them? This is something we're really at right now. I'll just pause quickly here. This is sort of an example of a storytelling strategy we did in the last couple of years, was launching a podcast series. It's available on all the podcast platforms. That's my plug. It's called Peel Talks Housing. And that was the first time we were able to bring in experts from across the sector with different views, different perspectives, and host that nuanced, in-depth discussion. It wasn't about showing how Peel is doing the best work or how Peel knows how the answers. It was not promotional. It was really just a way to bring people together. It was during COVID time. It was virtual. It actually helped us a lot to do that. We could chat about that more, how that worked, what we learned, but it was pretty successful. 7,000 plays for a municipal government-sponsored podcast about housing in 2022. It worked.
Thanks. And then Indro, again, for everyone out there in the virtual world. So I'm going to change gears a little bit and actually kind of talk about, we are a municipal government, Peel. And part of, and I think you can attest to this, Taylor, is that we are very dependent, and we really do need upper levels of government to step up and do more, as has been the case for a long time. So not only has our work, started to shift to, have that long-form conversation, it's also been about equipping our elected officials to advocate better, to be in a better position. So they're not the ones also having to, go through binders and binders full of policy and theory and ideas. What we've very much focused on recently is distilling things to something very simple for them so that they can kind of carry it with them wherever they go without too much complexity. And so for all the 1,001 plans that are out there right now trying to fix the housing crisis, we aren't saying this is the 75th plan you need to think of. What we are saying is here are the 4 principles and 4 ideas from a policy perspective you need to keep in mind as elected officials. Yes, there is an end to this crisis. Yes, it can be solved. And what we ultimately need to do is, we landed on 4 key themes. One is, making sure homes are used for homes, making sure we are building more homes, making sure we're properly funded as lower levels of government. And finally, you can't just build your way out of this. You need to focus on enhancing social and income supports for all residents. So those were kind of the 4 messages we distilled all our years of policy documentation down into for our elected officials to equip them in their discussions. But what we also realized with that is that those principles still relied on us as subject matter experts, as staff, to always be there to support them, to help them. And that isn't sustainable. So we also start to think about how do we make this message a bit more portable? So others in the sector, councillors themselves can fully grasp the totality of what we're asking them to do or what they should be doing. So we landed on this notion that we needed kind of expert, independent communication. And being government, I think this is working. We landed on yet another acronym, but it's the HOME acronym. HOME framework is what we call it. And it's talking about those 4 principles, in an infographic kind of way, in a way that they can just get out to the community and carry with them. And this is a bit of a bait and switch presentation because we know the title said, we're going to talk lots about the HOME framework, but we're actually not because we want to talk about what comes next after the HOME framework. So we developed this. It was very useful in one-to-ones with MPs and MPPs and with the sector, and is grounded in a whole lot of analytics. So it's not just principles and ideas. This is all available online. We've got a separate handout for this as well online. But we've done the math for all of these ideas as well, because at the end of the day, in the sector, math still matters. Yes, it's a human rights issue, but you still need to show the numbers for whatever it's worth. So all our principles have that grounding. But we've been realizing that even this, even all that effort that went into that, to equipping our elected officials, to equipping the sector with these principles, that's got limits. There's diminishing returns to engaging our ecosystem. To be blunt, we all know what the problem is. We've been dealing with this for decades, and the needle hasn't moved that dramatically. And one thing we're starting to think about is that elected officials are elected. We need to think about how to get the community involved, how to get people that aren't impacted by this crisis in a real way. They are comfortably housed. They don't see why they need to get involved. We are trying to think about how to get them engaged so that when they're at the ballot box, when they see somebody on the street, they are able to put two and two together and start, raising their voices and asking for change or investment. So it's not just all of us talking to each other, asking for investment. It's about getting the folks that, send their representatives to places of power. So we start to do a bit of audience analysis beyond kind of the four categories that Stewart talked about earlier. One of the things we've been out hearing a lot about is declining voter participation. So we did a bit of digging into that to understand what's happening. And as it turns out, in Canada, there's shockingly poor exit poll data. It's just not something we do well compared to other countries. But what we were able to glean from Elections Canada is that, if we look at kind of the last quote-unquote change election, the transition from Harper to Trudeau, to the most recent federal election, who's not showing up? And what it looks like is that it's working-age women and older men. They're not showing up for whatever reason. So when we start to think about who do we want to get engaged, who do we want to send a message to, maybe there's some thinking to be done about tailoring messages or specifically engaging these demographics. We also know from research that low-income households, beneficiary households, the folks we talked about, even though they are recipients of aid and assistance, they quite often don't show up and participate politically. So their voice also gets lost. Even though it's the most important voice, in many ways, as Stewart spoke about, that's also getting lost. So those are, who's not participating, some things we found. We wanted to share that with you. There's also, I think we've all encountered the notions of populism. For those of you that live in Ottawa, you felt this in a very direct way just a couple of years ago. But it turns out Canadian researchers are actually kind of at the forefront of understanding this shift politically, this shift from a left to right politics, where there's clear belief in a role for government, where it should be and where it shouldn't be, to this kind of open, ordered, populist approach where it's just different ideas about what government should be doing. And what's fascinating is that there's a common belief of injustice, that something needs to be done about injustice. And this is something different than what the left-right continuum used to be. So there's also opportunity here about kind of pursuing a new consensus and getting a lot more people on board with the changes that need to happen. And finally, one of the other things we've come across as we've tried to think about how to get this into the community is that the things we have been doing traditionally as a sector, focusing on economic models or costs or the benefits, that works for us. That works for speaking to each other as a sector. But it turns out what really works is personalized stories, as Taylor has kind of mentioned. So it's the plight of the poor and the privilege of the rich. And that also ties in neatly to this whole populist framework where you're getting these stories about injustice, and that's what drives and gets people's attention. So these are kind of things that we've been thinking about. We haven't actioned any of this. We've realized that we've reached the limits of kind of our home framework and distilling things and simplifying things for the sector. And now we want to kind of raise awareness in the broader community. And what we really kind of hope to do, or where we think we should be going, I'll just do this one, Stewart, and then hand it off, is making sure that those who are recipients of assistance are engaged. We figure out how to engage them, make them engaged participants. And for those that are ambivalent, the folks that believe in government support and intervention, have no issue with it, they just don't see why they need to get involved or why this is an issue, getting them involved as well. And kind of making a choice that, we have limited resources. So for those folks that don't believe in government support or intervention at all, but are very politically active. Maybe our limited resources shouldn't be focused on trying to convince them of the need for government intervention, but rather focus on those folks that believe and see a role for government support for social interventions, but just aren't showing up to participate for whatever reason. So that's kind of where we're at and what we're thinking about. And I'm going to flip it back to Stewart to kind of talk a little bit about tactics and where things might go from here.
So really just to wrap up, and it's basically a summary of what we've been talking about this whole morning, is just to make sure we're meeting people where they're at. We're targeting people deliberately. We don't want people to feel they must do years of study or have homework to do or have a PhD in policy to understand what we're talking about and the real issues people are facing. We also want to try whenever possible to be personal in our storytelling. It doesn't only have to be the client perspective. We want our staff to be more comfortable talking about their work. Social service work, in a good way, people can be very humble and shy and think, there's nothing to see here, please don't look at me, let me just keep my head down and do the work. We're trying to change the channel on that and make sure our staff and our leaders are more prolific, not only at conferences like these, but on talk radio, on podcast, in print, to make sure they're connecting name, face, title, and work. We need to do this constantly. Also, that's one thing we run the risk of just waiting for. It's World Homeless Day in October, it's National Housing Day in November, and then we have budget, so let's just put the campaigns to bed for a bit and wait till the next day of awareness. We have to be doing this all the time and not just waiting for a day of awareness, an election, or a really hot button issue or crisis that's emerging that we feel like we have to react to. The issue and the challenge we have also in a municipal government is we're not able, nor should we, and we could debate that, tell people how to vote, who to vote for, or even to vote. We're not really a voter enlisting body. But really what we want to do is make sure people have the knowledge to make the decisions that they feel is important to them and vote on the issues that matter to them. How do we do that? Of course, I'm just saying we have to do this constantly, and yet it is an election season. Elections are coming up. Now is the time to do this. Now is our time to beef up our communications, our engagement, and keep the conversation going. Indro, do you want to wrap up?
Oh, sure. Thanks. So, we were reflecting on what Chelsea and Taylor had kind of spoken to, and it's clear that public policy change is critical for, the systemic challenges that we face. And to Taylor's point, public policy does very much get baked in through budget cycles. There's a way this happens. There's real logistics and processes behind this. And one of the things, though, that we're finding is that, there's probably real limits to the influence that we have, even if we were to do everything perfectly with each other and with government. So there's got to be a way to bring in that broader community, the folks that really aren't impacted by this in their day-to-day lives, and kind of think about, how do we get them involved and encourage them to participate or make sure their voices are being heard too, and that they understand the stakes. So that's kind of, what we've been thinking about in terms of where we need to go as a region in housing services. And we thought, this would be a really great forum to have that discussion, pick your brains, and maybe even, there's some content in here that connects with you and resonates with you, especially as we get into this time in Canada where we've got multiple provincial elections, we have the possibility of a federal election at any moment, and of course municipal elections all across the country. It's a really kind of active, potentially unusual time in the country where the crisis has never been worse, and there's a panel of MPs just across the way, but how do we talk to them? How do we get their attention? So that's where we wanted to leave it. And we're all here, and we're going to go back to our tables.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our presenters. We do have 2 minutes left. We've run out of our Q&A time, but we can stay and have some Q&A. Just ask that it is lunchtime, so if anybody's going to leave the room, just do so really quietly in case somebody does want to come to the microphone to ask a question. And just a reminder to go to the microphone if you do have a question.
Hi, hello. Thank you for that. I'm with Inuit Teparit Kanatani, which is social advocacy for Inuit across Canada, and we work very closely with government, so this is all very helpful information. And I was just wondering if you were speaking about social policy and how that's a catapult for change, and so I'm wondering if you have any examples of public policy that has been implemented or changed in the recent times that you've seen an effective correlational change to service or to homelessness. Like, do you have an example of one? Yeah.
Hi, does this work? Okay. So one that comes to mind immediately, so I participate with the BC Coalition to End Youth Homelessness, and we have some other folks in the room who might have left that have worked alongside, and we have been advocating for a long time for policy change around the Child and Family Services Act, so services for young people who are in care or aging out of care. And through that advocacy, we have seen change that actually just came into law this past spring around services and supports being extended in the province of BC past the age of majority. So yes, it works. And was it painful at times? Absolutely. But worth it. And if you want more information about that, I can give you my card, and if you send me an email, I can send you all the steps we took. But yeah, it does work, and that is one of the ones that comes top of mind because it just got passed into law this past spring.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for all of your presentations. They were very informative. I was scribbling notes in chicken scratch, so I hope I can read it later. So my name is Cheyenne Rutnam. So I come from Ontario. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Ontario Children's Advancement Coalition, and I'm also the Ontario rep on the National Council of Youth and Care Advocates. And in Ontario, the regulatory changes that came into effect April 2023 for youth transitions from child welfare was because of our work. And also across the nation, a lot of the youth transition stuff is due to the National Council work as well. And one of the things that I didn't really hear too much about, although you touched some base on it, is the role of media. And I know that in our work, we literally applied so much pressure with media on the national level, but also on the provincial and local level, while also amplifying education to the public about issues that they don't understand. And that actually forced government to contact us and come to the table to partner with us. That then led to 3 years later, the regulatory changes. So I'm wondering if you can kind of speak more on the role of media and how people can effectively engage with media, because it's very under-resourced in an adequate manner. And there's so much that media can do as a partner as well.
Sure, thank you so much. This really gets back to that kind of, in my presentation, the summer part, but setting the agenda, looking at what are the items that government are talking about and what are they not talking about. And I think a lot of the times when we engage media, especially when we even ourselves consume media, it's those issues that kind of amplifying pain points, communicating pain points that to the rest of the country or province or city, you kind of go, oh my gosh, I didn't know that was happening. That's most of what happens in these media stories is I didn't know that was happening. It becomes, we're in just the nature of media right now, and it has been for a long time. What gets played is tragedy, and we don't want to wait on tragedy to spur something happening with government, and especially child welfare spaces, homelessness spaces. That's what we see a lot of the time. So how do we change that? So we have first looked at kind of non-traditional media has really been a champion of positive media. How do we go in that direction, especially for youth engagement and younger engagement? That's where people are getting kind of consuming. So we started there in a lot of cases of how do we get these kind of news stories and these issues and kind of those champion and like positive stories out via those channels. And as they begin to catch on, kind of traditional media sources then also pick it up that, oh my gosh, this kind of wonderful stories coming out of this small center. It's still that underdog story as well a lot, especially in small centers. Wow, look at this small center did so much. How can that be replicated? And I think that's when we make the jump from kind of non-traditional media to more traditional media is when you start changing how can it be replicated. That's the bigger picture because now they're trying to reach a broader audience and bigger levels of government. So that's when the conversation changes of look at the great work we're doing, getting it to kind of a certain water supply level, and then when we shift media, now how does that get applied? How does that catch government's attention of, oh, I see how that replicates on a provincial level, on a federal level, or what's my role in those two levels of government to ensure that other municipalities specifically could replicate this as well, whether it's via funding or regulatory strategies. But
I think that media has to be seen as one of your key stakeholders. It's huge, not just from the lens of putting pressure and getting the word out, but how they do that. Like, what is their role in ethical storytelling? So having your friends and staffer friends in the media and finding out what they're personally passionate about so that they're talking about these things all the time and not just when things go bad. So they have to be seen as one of the key stakeholders. And I also just can't let this opportunity pass by to thank you for your work on the standards, because those need to be adopted. And I do have to say, I come from BC, who has not and is not adopting them, and so we still have work to do there. But thank you for your work on that, because it is so important.
This is really vital, and I really enjoy what I'm hearing. And Cheyenne, when you were asking your question, I was just like trying so hard to not nod so aggressively. And I'm just looking around the room to make sure none of my bosses are here. I think we're good. In municipal government, at least in Peel, we don't do media relations well. We do not. And I feel like it's quite similar to, Taylor, what you were talking about with building relationships with government, focusing on kindness, understanding people's bottom line. Reporters can be very scary to people. We feel like they're out to get us, they're adversarial, they just want to tear us down. But at the end of the day, they're doing their job, they have deadlines, and they have to fill space in their papers and their websites. I can't tell you enough what it does to just reach out and say, I know you have a tight deadline, I can't give you this statement right now, I can't give you this funding negotiation agreement right now, but in a week, we could do an in-depth piece. I could grant you access to my director. We can sit down. That goes such a long way, and that really does change the story. So media is vital, but it really is a relational piece. And I would just encourage everyone, it's not easy, but invest in the time and just to be transparent of what you can share and what you can share and what you can't. Really helpful. And I'll admit, we don't do it well in our municipal government. We tend to see media as keep them over there, keep them quiet, let's be happy if they don't reach out, because that shows that we're not getting it wrong. But we need to flip that completely.
Just to kind of one thought that occurs to me as I listen, it's, one of the things that I feel we miss as a sector quite often is we kind of other and put folks on a pedestal, whether it's upper levels of government or even media. And at the end of the day, they are people and workers like us. They have very practical requirements and expectations. So kind of what Stewart spoke to in terms of deadlines and just needing to fill work. One of the conversations we've had with some friends in the press is really just the style of story that they're looking for, in terms of kind of something unique, something innovative, something where there's a human interest element, where it's fixed something for somebody, which sets a bit of attention. Nobody owes us their story as a service provider, but if we've been able to help somebody, and then how does that relate to the possibility of scaling something up? So kind of a story structure that way. And also the other practical piece of advice we've gotten is that weekends. Weekday news cycles are generally full, but it's the weekends that there's lots of opportunity to get pieces out in kind of traditional media spaces.
Yeah, I think that it's important when you touch on that banking stories so that you can have that agility when you get those requests. And the same way that we kind of talked about like getting your political government infrastructure ready and having a bank to go, having the same bank of stories to be able to answer that call. And again, it's still a solutions-based story that we get a lot of questions of, oh, the opioid crisis is so bad. Could you comment on that? And they're looking for a kind of lens of like, oh, we've seen this many tragedies, this many. But we could pivot that conversation to say, yes, here's a solution that's working in this community. Oh, and because I've connected with my sector partners, I also know what's working in BC. I also know what's working in Manitoba. So that you can answer those calls in a different way, and then you have a bank of your own stories that give that local connection that media is probably looking for. So it just expands that conversation.
And also, just to add to what all of you folks have been saying, there's also an importance for organizations and advocates to also leverage making stories for op-eds.
Yes.
So you don't have to be interviewed by a reporter or interviewed by whoever. You can actually write your own op-eds about the topics and make sure that you're still pushing the themes or thematic issue into the leadership as well.
Just for those that are online, it was mentioned that we should definitely be banking those stories for op-eds and using that as a tool to set the agenda, and absolutely.
Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to the presenters. Enjoy your lunch. And if you have a question later, you can also go into the app, select this section, and scroll down to see the presenters' information, their names, and their profiles, so you can connect that way as well. Thank you very much.